12-year-old girl walked into a hospital holding a baby, but when she revealed whose child it was, everyone was horrified. Subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Where are you watching us from? The morning air was crisp and cold, the faint sunlight casting long shadows across the parking lot of St. James Hospital. Inside, the facility buzzed quietly with the beginnings of the day shift. Nurses exchanged pleasantries as they prepared for rounds, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the sterile tang of disinfectant. At the front desk, Mrs. Elliott, a veteran receptionist with sharp eyes and a patient demeanor, glanced up from her paperwork when the automatic doors swished open. A small figure stepped inside, her movements hesitant and uncertain. Naomi, barely 12 years old, clutched a tiny bundle wrapped in an old blanket against her chest. Her oversized hoodie hung loosely over her petite frame, but it couldn't conceal the weariness etched into her face. Her eyes darted around nervously, avoiding contact with anyone. Mrs. Elliott straightened in her chair. "Sweetheart, are you lost?" she asked, her voice kind but cautious. Naomi didn't respond immediately. She simply shook her head, her grip tightening on the bundle in her arms. Behind the desk, Dr. Jess Campbell, an experienced pediatrician with a reputation for her no-nonsense approach, had been skimming through charts when she noticed the unusual scene. Setting her clipboard down, she stepped forward. "Hi there," Jess said gently, crouching slightly to meet the girl's gaze. "What's your name?" "Naomi," the girl whispered, barely audible. Jess's eyes flicked briefly to the bundle Naomi held. "Are you okay, Naomi? Is that a baby you're holding?" Naomi nodded, her face pale. I found him," she said, her voice trembling. "Outside my house." Jess exchanged a look with Mrs. Elliott. "Let's get you somewhere quiet," she said, motioning to a nurse who was standing nearby. "This way, Naomi." Naomi followed silently, her sneakers squeaking softly against the polished floor as they walked toward the examination room. Jess led her inside and gestured to a chair. Naomi sat down slowly, cradling the bundle closer to her chest. Her movements were protective, as if she feared someone might try to take the baby away. Nurse May Peters entered the room a moment later with a tray of medical supplies. "What have we got here?" May asked, her tone friendly. "This is Naomi," Jess said. "And this little one, well, we're going to figure that out." Naomi lowered her gaze as May approached. "May, can you take a look at the baby while I talk to Naomi?" "Of course," May said, her expression softening as she crouched beside the girl. "Naomi, may I hold him? Just for a minute." "I promise I'll be very careful." Naomi hesitated before nodding reluctantly. Slowly, she handed over the bundle. May unwrapped the blanket, revealing a tiny, sleeping newborn. His face was scrunched up in peaceful oblivion, his little fists curled near his chin. He couldn't have been more than a few hours old. "Oh my," May murmured, her professional composure slipping for just a moment. She glanced at Jess. "He's so small." Jess nodded, her eyes scanning Naomi. The girl sat rigidly, her hands gripping the hem of her hoodie. "Naomi," Jess began gently, "can you tell me more about where you found him?" Naomi shook her head. "I just found him outside," she said quickly. Her voice was thin, like a thread about to snap. Jess exchanged a glance with May, who was carefully swaddling the baby again. "We'll check him out thoroughly," Jess said. "May, can you get a neonatal crib ready?" May nodded and left the room with the baby, leaving Jess alone with Naomi. Jess pulled up a chair and sat across from her. "You're very brave to bring him here," she said, "but I need to make sure you're okay too. Are you hurt?" Naomi flinched but shook her head. I'm fine, she said quickly. Jess wasn't convinced. She noticed the faint pallor of the girl's skin and the way her hands trembled when she adjusted her hoodie. Naomi, I'm a doctor. I can help you if you're not feeling well. Can I take a look? Naomi pressed her lips together and shook her head more firmly. I'm fine, she insisted. Jess leaned back slightly, not wanting to push too hard. Okay, she said softly, but if you need anything, you just tell me, all right? Naomi nodded, but her eyes didn't meet Jess's. The girl's body language screamed fear, but Jess knew she couldn't force her to open up. Not yet. The door opened and May re-entered. The baby's in the NICU, she said. Vitals are stable, but I'd like to run some tests to be sure. Good, Jess said, standing. Naomi, why don't you come with me? Let's get you something to eat and a place to rest for a bit. Naomi hesitated, but eventually stood, clutching her hoodie like a shield. She followed Jess and May down the corridor, her small frame dwarfed by the hospital's long, sterile halls. As they walked, Jess couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Naomi's story than she was letting on. Something about the way she held herself, the way she avoided eye contact. It wasn't just exhaustion, it was fear. And Jess was determined to find out why. The bustling noise of the hospital felt louder to Naomi as she sat in a small, sterile room staring at her sneakers. The walls were an unwelcoming shade of pale blue, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights made the space feel colder than it was. Across from her, Dr. Jess Campbell watched quietly, trying to piece together the fragments of the story Naomi had given so far. The girl claimed she'd found the baby on her doorstep, but the facts didn't align. Jess had seen too many similar cases to ignore the signs. Naomi's pallor, her hesitant demeanor, and, most importantly, the physical evidence. Jess could tell Naomi had given birth recently, though the girl adamantly denied it. Nurse May Peters entered the room with a tray of food, warm soup and a sandwich. Here, sweetie, May said gently, placing the tray on the table. You've got to be hungry. Naomi shook her head. I'm fine, she murmured, her voice barely audible. Jess leaned forward. Naomi, it's important to take care of yourself. You don't have to eat everything, but a little food might help you feel better. After a moment of hesitation, Naomi reached for the sandwich. Her small hands trembled slightly as she picked it up, but she took a cautious bite. Jess and May exchanged a quick glance. Small progress was still progress. Jess decided to try again. Naomi, can you tell me more about the baby? Did you hear anyone outside before you found him? Maybe a car driving away? Naomi stiffened. No, she said quickly, I just found him, that's all. Her response was too sharp, too defensive. Jess recognized the walls going up and decided not to push harder just yet. Instead, she leaned back in her chair. It's okay, she said softly. You don't have to talk about it now. Just know we're here to help. The girl's shoulders relaxed a fraction, though her gaze remained fixed on the table. Jess stood and motioned for May to follow her outside the room. In the hallway, Jess closed the door behind them. Something isn't right, she said in a low voice. She's hiding something. May nodded. You think the baby's hers? I'd bet on it, Jess said. The physical signs are there. She's weak, probably from blood loss, and she flinched when I mentioned pain. But she's terrified of admitting the truth. May frowned. What do we do? If we press too hard, we could scare her off completely. Jess rubbed her temple. We give her time. Let her rest, keep her comfortable. Eventually, she might feel safe enough to open up. Before May could respond, a commotion echoed down the hallway. The sharp, booming voice of a man cut through the relative quiet. "Where's Naomi? I know she's here." Jess turned toward the source of the noise. A tall, broad-shouldered man stormed into the hospital lobby, his face flushed with anger. His boots thudded heavily against the tiled floor as he approached the reception desk. "That must be him," May muttered. "Stay here," Jess instructed. "I'll handle this." Jess approached the man, her professional demeanor intact. "Can I help you?" she asked firmly. The man turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "I'm looking for my stepdaughter, Naomi. Someone said she was here." Jess noticed the way his hands clenched into fists at his sides, the way his eyes darted around like he was looking for someone to blame. She could feel the tension rolling off him in waves. "She's safe," Jess said evenly, "but she's not well, and we're taking care of her. Who are you?" "Jim Harper," he said, his tone sharp. "Her stepfather. I want to see her, now." Jess folded her arms. "I understand your concern, Mr. Harper, but Naomi needs rest. She won't be seeing visitors right now." Jim's jaw tightened. "She's my responsibility. I'm taking her home." "Not until we're sure she's ready to leave," Jess said. Her tone was calm but firm, leaving no room for argument. Jim's face darkened. "You have no right to keep her here." Jess took a deliberate step closer. "Mr. Harper, this is a hospital. Our priority is Naomi's health. If you'd like to discuss this further, we can speak in my office." Jim stared at her, his anger barely contained. "Fine," he spat, "but this isn't over." As he stormed away toward the exit, Jess let out a slow breath. Something about him set her on edge. His aggression, his insistence, it all pointed to the same conclusion. He wasn't just a concerned guardian. He was part of the problem. Back in the room, Naomi sat frozen, her hands gripping the edge of the table. She'd heard Jim's voice, and her stomach twisted in knots. She knew he was furious, and she dreaded what might happen when she returned home. When Jess re-entered the room, Naomi's eyes darted to her. "Is he gone?" she whispered. "For now," Jess said, sitting across from her. "But Naomi, I need you to be honest with me. Are you safe at home?" Naomi didn't answer. She stared down at her lap, her knuckles white from gripping her hoodie. Jess softened her tone. "You don't have to go back if it's not safe. We can help you." Naomi finally looked up, tears pooling in her eyes. "He'll be so mad," she said, her voice trembling. "He always gets mad." Jess leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "You're not alone, Naomi. We'll protect you, but I need you to trust me." Naomi nodded slightly, though her fear was still evident. Jess knew it would take time, but she was determined to uncover the truth. For now, she would focus on keeping Naomi safe, no matter what it took. The walls of the hospital seemed to close in on Naomi as she sat quietly in her room, clutching the edge of her blanket. Outside, the sounds of hurried footsteps and muted voices echoed faintly. The room was quiet, but inside her chest, her heart thudded loudly, the rhythm mirroring her growing fear. She had heard Jim's voice earlier, booming through the hallways, filled with anger. Even though he wasn't in the room now, the memory of his rage lingered, pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't shake. Dr. Jess Campbell entered the room, carrying a clipboard and a cup of tea. She moved slowly, deliberately, as if trying not to startle Naomi. "Hey," Jess said softly, setting the tea on the bedside table. "How are you feeling?" Naomi shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "Fine," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Jess sat down in the chair next to the bed, crossing her legs. "I know, it's been a tough day," she said, But you're safe here, Naomi. No one can hurt you while you're with us." Naomi's hands tightened around the edge of the blanket, her knuckles white. She didn't respond, but Jess noticed the flicker of uncertainty in her expression. It was as if Naomi wanted to believe her, but couldn't quite let herself. "I spoke to your stepfather," Jess continued, keeping her tone even. "He was upset, but I told him you needed to stay here to rest. He's gone now." At the mention of Jim, Naomi flinched. She turned her head slightly, looking at the far wall. Jess leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Naomi, are you afraid of him?" For a moment, Naomi didn't move. Then, slowly, she nodded, her movements so subtle they were almost imperceptible. Jess felt a pang of sadness, but she kept her expression neutral. "You don't have to go back home," Jess said. "If you're not safe there, we can help. There are people who care about you, who want to protect you." Naomi shook her head quickly, her voice trembling. "He'll find me. He always finds me." The conviction in her voice sent a chill down Jess's spine. She leaned back slightly, giving Naomi some space. "Okay," Jess said softly. "We'll take this one step at a time. But I promise you, Naomi, we won't let anything happen to you." Later that evening, Naomi was alone in the room when the door opened, and Nurse May Peters entered with a tray of food. "Dinner time," May said with a small smile, setting the tray on the table. "I brought you something warm, soup, bread, and a little pudding for dessert. You need your strength." Naomi glanced at the tray but didn't move. May sat on the edge of the bed, her hands resting in her lap. "You know," May began, her voice light, "when I was a kid, I hated soup. My mom used to make me eat it when I was sick, and I thought it was the worst thing in the world." Naomi looked up at her, surprised by the sudden personal story. May smiled. "But then I got older and realized soup wasn't so bad. It was comforting, like a warm hug when you needed it most." Naomi hesitated, then reached for the bowl. She picked up the spoon and took a small sip. It was warm and savory, and she felt a tiny flicker of comfort despite herself. May watched her for a moment, then gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder before leaving the room. That night, Naomi lay awake in the hospital bed, staring at the ceiling. Her body ached, and her mind raced with a whirlwind of fears. She thought about Jim, his voice, his threats, the way he always seemed to control everything. She thought about the baby, safe in the NICU, and how she'd ended up in this impossible situation. When the door creaked open, Naomi tensed, but it was only Dr. Campbell. Jess stepped inside carrying a small blanket. "I thought you might want an extra layer," she said, draping it over Naomi's legs. "It gets cold in here at night." Naomi didn't respond, but her fingers brushed against the soft fabric. Jess sat down in the chair by the bed. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to," she said. "But I'll stay for a little while, just in case." The silence stretched between them, heavy and thick. Naomi's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. Finally, she whispered, "He's going to be so mad." Jess leaned forward, her voice gentle. "Naomi, he doesn't have the right to hurt you. No one does." Naomi sniffled, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "You don't know him. He gets so angry. And my mom, she doesn't do anything." Jess's heart broke at the words. She kept her voice calm. "It's not your fault, Naomi. None of this is your fault. And it's okay to let people help you." For the first time, Naomi looked at her, her dark eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. "You really won't let him take me?" Jess shook her head. "Not as long as I'm here." Naomi stared at her for a moment longer, then nodded slightly. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The next morning, Naomi woke to the sound of voices outside her room. She sat up slowly, her body still aching. When the door opened, it was Nurse May again, carrying a tray with breakfast. "Good morning, sunshine," May said cheerfully. "Time to fuel up for the day." Naomi gave her a small smile, the first May had seen since she arrived. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give May hope. The hospital was quieter now, the usual morning rush settling into a steady rhythm. Naomi sat on the edge of her bed, absently twisting the hem of her blanket between her fingers. The breakfast tray Nurse May had brought earlier sat untouched on the side table. She wasn't hungry. The weight of the previous day still pressed heavily on her chest, and her thoughts were a tangled mess. Her gaze flicked to the door as it creaked open, revealing a new face. A woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and a warm smile entered the room, carrying a clipboard. She introduced herself as Carla Price, a social worker who had been called in to help. "Good morning, Naomi," Carla said gently, pulling up a chair beside the bed. "How are you feeling today?" Naomi shrugged, her eyes fixed on her lap. "Okay," she mumbled. Carla nodded, not pushing for more. "I heard you've had a tough few days," she said. "I want you to know that I'm here to help. You don't have to go through this alone." Naomi glanced at her briefly before lowering her eyes again. The kindness in Carla's voice was disarming, but trust wasn't something Naomi gave easily. She'd learned the hard way that people who seemed kind could turn cruel just as quickly. Carla leaned forward slightly, her tone soft. "Sometimes it helps to talk about what's bothering us. But if you're not ready, that's okay too. We can take things at your pace." For a moment, it seemed like Naomi might respond, but then she shook her head, her grip on the blanket tightening. Carla didn't press. Instead, she sat with her quietly, letting the silence stretch between them. Later that day, Dr. Jess Campbell returned to check on Naomi. She carried a notebook and pen, setting them on the table beside the untouched breakfast tray. "Naomi," Jess began, "I thought maybe writing could help. Sometimes it's easier to put your thoughts on paper than to say them out loud." Naomi looked at the notebook but didn't touch it. Jess sat beside her, keeping her voice calm and steady. "You don't have to share anything if you don't want to. This is just for you." Naomi hesitated, then reached for the pen. She opened the notebook but didn't write anything. Instead, she stared at the blank page, her mind racing. Jess gave her space, quietly stepping out of the room to let her think. By evening, Naomi had scrawled a few words in the notebook, though the page was mostly empty. She tucked it under her pillow when Nurse May came in to check on her. "How are you doing, sweetie?" May asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. Naomi shrugged. "Okay," she said softly. May studied her for a moment, then smiled. "I wanted to tell you something. When I was about your age, I went through something scary too. I didn't think anyone would believe me, but I found someone who did. That changed everything for me." Naomi looked at her, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "What happened?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. May's smile turned sad. "It's a long story, but the important part is that I got through it, and so will you." The words stayed with Naomi long after May left the room. She lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying May's story. For the first time, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was a way out. The next day, Carla returned, her gentle persistence slowly chipping away at Naomi's defenses. She brought a small stuffed bear, its fur soft and worn. "This little guy helped me through a lot when I was a kid." Carla said, placing it on the bed. "I thought he might keep you company." Naomi hesitated before picking up the bear. She hugged it to her chest, its familiar softness bringing a flicker of comfort. Carla smiled, sitting down beside her. "Can I tell you a story?" she asked. Naomi nodded, clutching the bear tightly. Carla began to tell her about a young girl she once worked with, someone who had been in a difficult situation but found the strength to ask for help. "She was scared, just like you," Carla said, but she realized that talking to someone she trusted made all the difference. Naomi didn't say anything, but her grip on the bear tightened. Carla noticed and decided to take a chance. "Naomi," she said gently, "is there something you want to tell me? Something you've been holding inside?" For a moment, Naomi froze. Her breath hitched and her eyes filled with tears. She looked away, biting her lip. Carla waited patiently, not pushing, just letting her know she was there. Finally, Naomi whispered, "He'll be mad." Carla leaned closer, her voice soft and steady. "Who, Naomi? Who will be mad?" Naomi hesitated, then shook her head. I can't say." Carla placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's okay. You don't have to say anything right now, but when you're ready, I'll be here." That evening, Dr. Campbell returned to Naomi's room. The notebook was still tucked under her pillow, and the stuffed bear sat beside her on the bed. Jess noticed that Naomi looked slightly less tense, though the fear in her eyes was still there. "How's the bear treating you?" Jess asked, sitting down. Naomi glanced at it and gave a small nod. "He's nice," she said. Jess smiled. "I'm glad. And how about you? Are you feeling any better?" Naomi shrugged, but she didn't seem as withdrawn as before. Jess decided to take a chance. "Naomi, I know you've been through a lot, and I know it's hard to talk about, but whatever it is, you don't have to carry it alone." Naomi looked at her, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. For a moment, it seemed like she might say something, but then she looked away. Jess didn't push. She knew these things took time. "Whenever you're ready," Jess said softly. "We're here for you." As Jess left the room, she felt a flicker of hope. Naomi was beginning to open up piece by piece. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep trying. The pale morning light filtered through the blinds in Naomi's hospital room. She sat cross-legged on the bed, the small stuffed bear from Carla clutched tightly to her chest. The silence was heavy, broken only by the soft hum of the hospital's heating system. Her thoughts were a whirlwind, circling the same fear over and over again. What would happen if she told the truth? Dr. Jess Campbell entered the room with her usual calm demeanor. She carried a clipboard in one hand and a steaming cup of tea in the other. "Good morning, Naomi," she said softly, setting the tea on the bedside table. "Did you manage to get some sleep?" Naomi shrugged, avoiding eye contact. Jess sat down in the chair beside the bed, giving her a moment before speaking again. "Naomi, I've been thinking about what you told Carla yesterday," she said gently, "about someone being mad if you talk." Naomi's fingers tightened around the bear. She didn't respond, but Jess could see the tension in her body. "I want you to know," Jess continued, "that no matter what you tell us, we're here to help you. You don't have to be afraid." Naomi glanced at her, her dark eyes filled with hesitation. Jess waited patiently, her expression open and non-judgmental. After a long silence, Naomi finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "If I tell you, you have to promise he won't find me." Jess felt a pang of sadness at the fear in Naomi's words. She nodded firmly. "I promise, Naomi. You're safe here." Naomi hesitated, her hands trembling as she adjusted the bear in her lap. Finally, she took a deep breath and said, "The baby. He's mine." The words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Jess didn't react immediately, giving Naomi the space to continue. Tears welled up in the girl's eyes as she spoke again. "I lied about finding him. I had him at home." Jess's heart ached at the admission, but she kept her tone calm and steady. "Thank you for telling me," she said softly. "That must have been so hard for you." Naomi nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks now. "It hurt so much," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't know what to do." Jess reached out, placing a comforting hand on Naomi's shoulder. "You were incredibly brave to come here. You did the right thing." Naomi clutched the bear even tighter, her knuckles white. "He's going to be so angry," she said, her voice trembling. "Who, Naomi?" Jess asked gently. "Who are you afraid of?" Naomi's breath hitched, and for a moment Jess thought she might shut down again. But then, in a voice so quiet it was almost inaudible, Naomi said, "Jim." The name hung in the air like a dark cloud. Jess's jaw tightened, though she kept her expression neutral. "Your stepfather?" she asked. Naomi nodded, her tears flowing freely now. He made me." Her voice broke, and she buried her face in the bear, sobbing. Jess felt a surge of anger and sadness, but she knew she needed to stay calm for Naomi's sake. She sat quietly, letting the girl cry, and when Naomi's sobs began to subside, she spoke again. "Naomi, I'm so sorry this happened to you. None of it is your fault." Naomi looked up at her, her eyes red and swollen. "But I didn't tell anyone," she said, her voice thick with guilt. I was too scared." "You were just a child, Naomi," Jess said firmly. "It wasn't your responsibility to stop him. It was his responsibility not to hurt you." Naomi nodded weakly, her tears still falling. Jess handed her a tissue and she wiped her face, taking deep, shuddering breaths. That afternoon, Carla Price returned to the hospital, and Jess filled her in on Naomi's confession. Carla's face grew somber as she listened. "This is worse than I thought," she said quietly. "We need to involve the authorities immediately." "I agree," Jess said, "but we have to handle this carefully. Naomi's already terrified." Carla nodded. "I'll contact the police and make sure we have a child advocate present when they speak to her. We'll also need to arrange for her to stay somewhere safe." Jess frowned. "What about her mother?" Carla hesitated. "If what Naomi said is true, her mother has been complicit, or at least neglectful. She may not be a safe option." Jess sighed, her heart heavy. Naomi deserves better than this. That evening, 2 police officers arrived at the hospital, accompanied by a child advocate named Elaine. Jess introduced them to Naomi, who sat stiffly on the bed, her eyes darting nervously between the strangers. Elaine knelt beside Naomi, her voice soft and reassuring. "Hi, Naomi. I'm here to help make sure you're safe. You don't have to talk to anyone unless you want to, okay?" Naomi nodded, clutching the bear like a lifeline. Elaine sat with her for a while, asking gentle questions and explaining that the police were there to protect her, not to scare her. Slowly, Naomi began to open up, repeating what she had told Jess earlier. As she spoke, the officers took notes, their expressions a mix of professionalism and quiet anger. By the time Naomi finished, her voice was hoarse and her hands trembled. Elaine gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "You were so brave, Naomi. Thank you for telling us." Naomi nodded, though her fear was still palpable. Jess stayed by her side, offering quiet encouragement. After the police left, Jess and Carla sat with Naomi to discuss the next steps. "You're not going back to that house," Carla said firmly. We're going to find a safe place for you and your baby." Naomi looked at them, her eyes wide. "What about Jim? What if he tries to find me?" Jess placed a hand over Naomi's. "We won't let that happen. The police are going to make sure he can't hurt you or anyone else." Naomi's lip quivered, but she nodded. For the first time, she felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of the darkness. The morning air in the hospital felt heavier than usual. Naomi sat by the window in her room, staring out at the cloudy sky. Her fingers absent-mindedly played with the stuffed bear Carla had given her, but her mind was far away, lost in the chaos of the last 24 hours. She had told the truth, a truth she had hidden for so long, and now everything felt fragile, like one wrong move could shatter everything. Dr. Jess Campbell entered the room with a small, reassuring smile. "Good morning, Naomi," she said gently. "How are you feeling today?" Naomi shrugged, her eyes not leaving the window. "Okay," she mumbled, though her tone betrayed her lingering fear. Jess pulled up a chair beside her, holding a folder in her hands. "The police are moving forward with your case," she said carefully. "They've arrested Jim." At the mention of his name, Naomi flinched, her grip tightening on the bear. Jess reached out, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "He can't hurt you anymore," Jess assured her. "You're safe now." Naomi turned to face her, tears welling up in her eyes. "What if he gets out?" she whispered. "What if he comes for me?" Jess shook her head firmly. "We're going to make sure that doesn't happen. You have so many people looking out for you now. Me, Carla, the police. You're not alone, Naomi." Naomi nodded slowly, but the fear in her eyes didn't completely fade. Jess handed her a tissue and gave her a moment to collect herself before speaking again. "There's something else I need to talk to you about," Jess said gently. "The police are going to need more details from you about what happened. They want to make sure they have everything they need to keep Jim away for good." Naomi's heart sank. The thought of reliving those moments, of saying them out loud again, made her stomach churn. "Do I have to?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jess nodded, her expression soft. "I know it's hard, but it's important. You've already been so brave, Naomi. This is just one more step to make sure you and your baby are safe." Naomi looked down at the bear in her lap, her fingers brushing over its soft fur. After a long silence, she whispered, "Okay." That afternoon, Carla arrived with Elaine, the child advocate, and 2 detectives. They met in a private room, the blinds drawn to create a sense of security. Naomi sat in a chair, the bear clutched tightly in her lap as Carla and Elaine sat beside her. "Hi, Naomi," Elaine said gently. "We're going to take things slow, okay? You can tell us as much or as little as you want." Naomi nodded, her throat tight. One of the detectives, a tall woman with a calm demeanor, began asking questions in a soft, steady voice. "Naomi, can you tell us about the first time Jim hurt you?" The room fell silent except for the faint hum of the heater. Naomi stared at the table in front of her, her hands trembling. Finally, she took a deep breath and began to speak. Over the next hour, Naomi recounted everything. How Jim started coming into her room at night, how he threatened her to keep quiet, and how her mother always looked the other way. Her voice cracked several times and tears streamed down her face, but Elaine and Carla were there, offering gentle reassurances. When she spoke about the pregnancy, the room grew even quieter. Naomi described the fear and confusion she felt, hiding her growing belly under baggy clothes and avoiding questions at school. She talked about giving birth alone in her bedroom, muffling her cries with a pillow so Jim wouldn't hear. By the time she finished, Naomi was exhausted, her face pale and tear-streaked. Carla placed a hand on her shoulder, her voice filled with a quiet pride. "You were so brave, Naomi. Thank you for telling us." The detectives exchanged solemn glances. One of them spoke up. "Naomi, what you've been through is horrible, and none of it is your fault. We're going to make sure Jim pays for what he's done." Naomi nodded weakly, clutching the bear tighter. "What about my mom?" she asked, her voice small. "Does she know?" Carla hesitated before answering. "We've spoken to your mom," she said carefully. "Right now, she's struggling to accept what happened, but our priority is making sure you and your baby are safe." Naomi didn't respond. Deep down, she had hoped her mother would finally stand up for her, but a part of her knew that wasn't likely. That evening, after the meeting, Carla and Jess met to discuss Naomi's next steps. "She needs to be placed in a safe environment immediately," Carla said. "There's no way she can go back home." Jess nodded. "Agreed. Do we have any foster families available?" "There's one couple I've worked with before," Carla said. "Lisa and Mark. Kind, experienced, and they've taken in young mothers before. I'll reach out to them tonight." "And the baby?" Jess asked. "They'll take both Naomi and the baby," Carla assured her. "They have the resources to care for both." Jess exhaled, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "Good. Naomi deserves to feel safe." The next day, Naomi sat in her room, staring out the window as the sun began to set. Jess entered quietly, pulling up a chair beside her. "Hey, Naomi," she said softly. "I have some news for you." Naomi turned to her, her expression wary. "What is it?" "We found a place for you and the baby," Jess said. "A family who can take care of both of you. It's a safe home where you can rest and heal." Naomi's brow furrowed. "What about my mom?" she asked. Jess hesitated. "Right now, it's best if you stay somewhere else. Your mom needs time to figure some things out, and we need to make sure you're safe." Naomi looked down at the bear in her lap. "I don't want to go anywhere without my baby," she said quietly. Jess smiled gently. "You won't have to. You'll stay together." Naomi's eyes filled with tears, but this time they weren't tears of fear. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to hope. Naomi sat on the edge of her hospital bed, staring at the packed bag Nurse May had helped her prepare. The sight of it felt surreal. For months, she had lived with the crushing weight of secrecy and fear, unable to imagine a life beyond the suffocating walls of her home. And now she was leaving, not just for herself, but with her baby. The door opened quietly, and Carla Price stepped inside, her kind smile putting Naomi slightly at ease. "Are you ready, Naomi?" Carla asked gently. Naomi nodded, though her hands trembled slightly in her lap. "What if they don't like me?" she whispered. Carla crouched beside her, placing a comforting hand on her knee. "Lisa and Mark are wonderful people," she said. "They've taken in kids before, some who've been through really tough situations just like you. They're going to take care of you and your baby." Naomi's gaze dropped to her lap. What if I mess up?" Carla gave her knee a reassuring squeeze. "You're not going to mess up, Naomi. You're stronger than you think, and you don't have to do this alone anymore." Naomi nodded again, though her anxiety didn't completely fade. Carla stood and reached for the bag. "Let's take this one step at a time, okay? Lisa and Mark are waiting for us." The drive to Lisa and Mark's house was quiet. Naomi staring out the window as the scenery changed from the busy streets near the hospital to a quiet, tree-lined suburb. Her son, who she had named Elijah, was bundled safely in a car seat beside her. His soft coos filled the car intermittently, grounding her in the present. When they pulled up to the house, Naomi's chest tightened. It was a modest, two-story home with a well-kept yard and a small garden lining the walkway. Everything about it looked warm and inviting, but Naomi couldn't shake the nervous energy bubbling inside her. Carla parked the car and turned to her. "You ready?" Naomi hesitated before nodding. She unbuckled Elijah's car seat with shaking hands, carefully lifting him into her arms. His small weight against her chest gave her a sliver of courage as she followed Carla up the walkway. The door opened before they reached it, and Lisa appeared, her warm smile reaching her eyes. She was a petite woman with curly brown hair and an air of calm about her. Behind her stood Mark, a tall man with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor. "Hello, Naomi," Lisa said, stepping forward. "And this must be Elijah." Naomi nodded, her grip tightening on the baby. Lisa's smile softened. "You've been through so much. We're so glad you're here." Lisa ushered them inside, where the scent of freshly baked cookies filled the air. The living room was cozy, with a large sofa, a soft rug, and toys neatly arranged in one corner. Naomi noticed a crib set up near the sofa, and her chest tightened. These people had thought about Elijah. They had made space for him. Mark stepped forward, his voice quiet and kind. "Naomi, we just want you to know that this is your home now. You and Elijah can stay here as long as you need." Naomi nodded, unable to find her voice. She followed Lisa into a small, sunny room at the back of the house. It had a bed covered in a quilt, a rocking chair in the corner, and a crib by the window. "This is your space," Lisa said, gesturing to the room. "You can decorate it however you'd like." Naomi stared at the room, her emotions swirling. It felt strange, safe, but strange. She placed Elijah in the crib and ran her fingers over the soft bedding. "It's nice," she said softly. Lisa smiled. "We're glad you like it. If you need anything at all, you just let us know, okay?" Naomi nodded, though her mind still buzzed with questions. Could she trust them? Would they get tired of her? Would she ever truly feel safe? Over the next few days, Naomi settled into a tentative routine. Lisa and Mark were patient and kind, never pushing her to talk but always making sure she felt supported. Lisa helped her learn how to care for Elijah, showing her how to feed him, change him, and soothe him when he cried. "You're doing great, Naomi," Lisa said one evening as Naomi carefully rocked Elijah to sleep. "He's lucky to have you." Naomi glanced at her, unsure how to respond. "I don't feel like I'm doing great," she admitted. "Sometimes, I don't know if I can do this." Lisa sat beside her. "You're not alone in this. You've been through so much, but you're here, and you're trying. That's what matters." Naomi looked down at Elijah, his tiny face peaceful in sleep. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could do this. Meanwhile, the legal case against Jim Harper was gaining momentum. Carla kept Naomi informed, though she was careful not to overwhelm her with details. "He's been charged with multiple counts," Carla explained during one of her visits, "and the evidence you provided will make it hard for him to deny what he's done." Naomi nodded, though the thought of facing him in court made her stomach churn. "Will I have to see him?" she asked, her voice small. "Maybe," Carla admitted, "but we'll be there with you every step of the way. You won't be alone." As the days turned into weeks, Naomi began to feel the tiniest sparks of hope. She started to trust Lisa and Mark, leaning on them for guidance and support. She bonded with Elijah, learning to recognize his cries and finding joy in his little milestones. One evening, as she sat on the porch with Lisa watching the sunset, Naomi turned to her. Do you think we'll be okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lisa smiled, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "I do," she said. "It won't be easy, but you're stronger than you think, Naomi, and we're here for you." Naomi looked out at the horizon, the golden light casting a warm glow over the yard. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe that safety and happiness might be within reach. The sun rose quietly over the modest house, casting a golden glow over the front yard where a soft breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers. Inside, Naomi sat in the small room she now called her own, gently rocking Elijah in her arms. His tiny hands clutched the edge of her shirt as he drifted off to sleep. The past weeks had been a whirlwind of change, fear, and cautious hope, but now, in this quiet moment, she felt something she hadn't known in a long time: peace. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Lisa stepped inside, her face warm with a gentle smile. "Good morning, Naomi," she said softly. "Breakfast is ready whenever you are." Naomi nodded. "I'll be down in a minute," she replied. Her voice, though still quiet, held more confidence than it had when she first arrived. Lisa gave her a reassuring nod before leaving the room, and Naomi turned her attention back to Elijah, pressing a soft kiss to his forehead before placing him in the crib. In the dining room, the table was set with plates of pancakes, scrambled eggs, and fresh fruit. Mark was already sitting with a cup of coffee, flipping through a newspaper. He glanced up as Naomi entered and offered her a warm smile. "Morning, Naomi," he greeted her. "How's Elijah today?" "He's good," Naomi replied, taking a seat. "He slept through most of the night." "That's great to hear," Lisa said as she placed a glass of orange juice in front of Naomi. "You're doing such a good job with him." Naomi ducked her head slightly, a faint smile tugging at her lips. The kindness in Lisa and Mark's voices still felt unfamiliar, but it was beginning to feel real. Later that day, Carla stopped by for her regular visit. Naomi had come to trust her, though their conversations were often heavy. Carla sat across from Naomi in the living room, a folder of papers in her lap. "I have some updates about the case," Carla began, her tone gentle. Naomi stiffened slightly but nodded for her to continue. "The charges against Jim have been officially filed, and the evidence you provided is strong. It's unlikely he'll be able to avoid a conviction." Naomi's hands tightened around the stuffed bear that rarely left her side. "Will I have to see him again?" she asked, her voice trembling. Carla hesitated before answering. "There's a possibility you'll need to testify," she admitted, "but we'll make sure you're supported every step of the way. You won't be alone." Naomi nodded slowly, though the thought of facing Jim again made her stomach churn. "What about my mom?" she asked quietly. "Have you talked to her?" Carla's expression softened. "She's been struggling to come to terms with everything," she said carefully. "Right now, we're focusing on you and Elijah. Your safety and well-being are the priority." Naomi looked down at the bear in her lap, her emotions swirling. A part of her still longed for her mother's support, but she knew better than to expect it. "Okay," she said softly. Over the next few weeks, Naomi settled into life at Lisa and Mark's house. Slowly, she began to trust them, leaning on their guidance as she navigated the challenges of motherhood. Elijah grew stronger each day, his tiny milestones filling Naomi with a sense of pride and purpose. Lisa and Mark encouraged Naomi to think about her future. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Lisa asked gently, "Have you thought about going back to school?" Naomi hesitated, the idea both exciting and terrifying. "I don't know if I can," she admitted. "I've missed so much." "You can," Lisa said firmly. "You're smart, Naomi, and we'll help you catch up. Education is important, and it'll open up so many opportunities for you and Elijah." Naomi looked at Elijah, who was playing on a blanket nearby, his tiny hands reaching for a soft toy. For his sake, she wanted to try. When the day of the court hearing finally arrived, Naomi felt like her chest was caving in. She sat in the waiting area of the courthouse, her hands trembling as she clutched the bear Carla had given her. Lisa sat beside her, holding her other hand tightly. "You don't have to do this alone," Lisa said softly. "We're right here." When Naomi was called to the stand, her heart pounded in her chest. She stepped forward slowly, her knees shaking, but when she looked out at the faces in the courtroom, Carla, Lisa, Mark, and Elaine, all sitting in quiet support, she found the courage to speak. Naomi recounted everything, her voice trembling but steady. She told the truth, no matter how painful it was to say. When she finished, the room was silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Weeks later, Carla brought the news. Jim had been convicted and sentenced to a lengthy prison term. Naomi's testimony, along with the evidence provided by the hospital and police, had been pivotal. Justice had been served. Naomi felt a mixture of relief and lingering sadness. The man who had caused her so much pain could no longer hurt her, but the scars he left behind wouldn't fade overnight. Still, she was free. In the months that followed, Naomi began to rebuild her life. She enrolled in a local school program for young mothers, where she met other girls who had faced similar struggles. She found strength in their stories and began to share her own, finding healing in the process. Lisa and Mark continued to support her, providing a stable home where she could grow and thrive. Elijah grew into a happy, curious baby, his laughter filling the house with joy. One evening, as the sun set over the neighborhood, Naomi sat on the porch with Elijah in her lap. She watched as the sky turned shades of orange and pink, a soft breeze brushing against her face. Lisa stepped outside holding 2 mugs of tea. She handed one to Naomi and sat beside her. "What are you thinking about?" Lisa asked. Naomi smiled faintly, looking down at Elijah. "About how far we've come," she said, "and about the future." Lisa placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's bright, Naomi, for both of you." Naomi nodded, her heart swelling with a quiet but profound sense of hope. For the first time in what felt like forever, she believed it. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt and inspiring tales. Be sure to check out our other videos and share this one with your friends and family to spread the message. Stay tuned for more, and we'll see you in the next video.